This is Chapter 7, Part 1. The title of this chapter is The Nature of Quantitative Research. In the last chapter, we went over the steps to be able to do a literature search to find the sources, the articles that you need to put together a literature review for a section of a paper, or sometimes students get assigned a literature review for the whole paper, basically, where you review studies on a given topic. So we skip forward now to the section of a study where you're going to collect your data and analyze your data, and to do so in a quantitative way. Remember, quantitative refers to numbers as opposed to focusing on words and what people are telling you in interviews in terms of words. Here, we're reducing everything down to numbers. So we're going to get into some of the specifics on that in this chapter. What is a concept? We want to start at the highest level. A paper is very often will not only have a literature review section, but it'll also have a section on theory and the hypothesis, where, remember that deductive approach, where you take a theory of your choosing and you want to test it and see if it's true, and so you derive from it a specific hypothesis. Say, for example, that hanging out with, if you have more delinquent friends, that's going to raise the risk that you have acted violently. Let's say that's your hypothesis that comes from whatever theory that you're interested in. So we kind of skipped over focusing a lot on sort of theories and hypotheses, and that will come up in different places throughout the semester. But the concepts refer to the ideas, that the things that we're wanting to learn something about. So let's imagine we have a hypothesis where we want to see if associating with delinquent friends tends to, it raises the chances that you end up getting into fights, attacking people, and being physically aggressive. In this case, if that's your hypothesis, your concepts are delinquent friends is one concept, and violent behavior is the other concept. So concepts are what the building blocks. We're very often in research looking to see what is related to what is causing what concept is causing another concept. And so as it says here, the concepts are building blocks of theory. So your theory is going to say, here's the reason why hanging out with bad friends, it makes you more inclined to be violent. Maybe they're teaching you bad example, teaching you bad values, pro-violence values. Maybe they're setting a bad example for you where they're fighting and maybe they're winning, and you're impressed that they're so tough and they get their way with other people, and you want to be like that. So whatever the theory is, those concepts are building blocks of that theory. Violence, delinquent friends, whatever, pro-violent values. Those are all different components of your theory, and we test to see if those components are related to each other. So these concepts are labels that we give to elements of the social world. They're categories for the organization of ideas and observations. Concepts, I would say, I'm going to depart a little bit from the authors here who focus on how concepts are useful to provide explanations for a certain aspect of the social world, or standing for things we want to explain, or giving a basis for measuring variation. That's all true, but what I want to stress is that concepts are important because they help us decide what exactly it is that we want to study. Because if we're studying violence, we have to decide exactly what we mean by that. What are the boundaries that we're going to set for things that we'll include and call those violence, and other things that we will exclude and we won't call those violence. So, for example, people use the term violence for a lot of different things. But when you're trying to figure this out, someone say, well, maybe we should include nasty comments that people say to each other as somehow a form of violence. Well, usually violence researchers will look at that and say, well, they tend to see violence as where you're doing, they set the threshold higher where it's more serious, more injurious stuff that gets counted as violence. And just saying something nasty to somebody is not harmful enough according to this kind of approach, or it's a little bit of a different thing than acting violently. So you might want to include threatening behavior, like if you said to somebody, I'm going to kill you. It's words, it's not actually attacking somebody, but it is threatening serious harm, or in this case, even death. So usually violent threats like that get included as violence. But again, these are debates you can have about what should be included or not included. So the concepts end up, in my mind, being very important because they help us figure out what precisely it is that we're studying, what's going to be included and what's not going to be included. So let's talk about measurement. We've already talked about it in the previous chapter. We need to measure. Well, I think the best way to explain this is to understand that when you do the scientific method, the way we learn things from the scientific method is we compare different things. Usually, when we're doing the social sciences, sociology, social work, etc., we're usually comparing people. So imagine if you had two brothers, let's just use that as an example, one named Tommy and the other one named Richard. And for some reason, Richard was somebody who often got involved in violence, was attacking people all the time, and seemed to really have violent inclinations. And yet his brother, who was raised in the same household, Tommy, but with the same parents and the same environment, was much more peaceful and law-abiding and gets along with people and doesn't get into fights. So what the scientific approach does is it says, okay, you see a difference there. Why? Where does the difference come from? And what you do is you look to see differences in those boys that could help explain their violence. So let's stick with our delinquent friends example. Maybe for some reason Richard fell in with friends. He just kind of by accident ended up making friends who liked to fight and had pro-violent attitudes. And Johnny didn't. He ended up with a bunch of friends who were much more peaceful and thought that violence was terrible and that they were into other things, lawful sorts of activities. And so that could help explain why Johnny turned out like he did and Richard is inclined to violence because, looking at the lives of both of them, they had different kinds of friends. See, so that's the scientific method, is you have to compare different, in this case, different people and try to identify differences between the two of them that can help explain why one is violent, one is peaceful. So to be able to make those comparisons, you have to have some sort of way to measure. If you're talking about violence, you have to measure the violence in one kid and measure the violence in the other kid and do so in a precise, valid way. That's the only way you can compare. If to know whether somebody's higher on something or lower than somebody else, you have to have a measurement. And hopefully, and the more precise it is, the better. So to be able to delineate fine differences between people, organizations, or other units of analysis, you have to measure. And especially if you're going to be able to delineate, or meaning be able to observe small differences between people, then you really need to have accurate measurements. Not rough stuff. You have to be accurate if you're going to, let's say that Johnny and Richard were very similar to each other in violence. Well, you need to have an accurate measure. If Richard's still a little bit more violent, then you need to have a refined measure so it will be able to detect the difference between the two boys. If it's a really rough measurement, then it may seem like the two boys are the same when actually they're not. So needs to be the more precise is better. And we've already talked in a previous chapter how about your form of measurement needs to be consistent. Because if you hop on those weight scales and they give you different weights every time, well, then you can't compare why is this person heavier and this person lighter if you can't even trust your numbers. You can't trust your measurements, and so you're not going to have a valid, a good, solid study and learn anything in a solid way unless you have consistent measurements. And then also we measure to produce precise estimates of the degree of the relationship between two concepts. So this is taken a little further than probably we need to, but what they're saying here is let's stick with our example of the relationship between having delinquent friends and acting violently. You need to have accurate measurements of those two things. How many delinquent friends does this kid have? how often has he been involved in violence. You have to have accurate numbers there to be able to figure out, is there a strong connection between having delinquent friends and violence, or is it a weak connection, or is there no connection at all? And so you have to have precise measurements to be able to figure out how strong the connection is, whether it really makes a difference or not. So that's another thing. And we'll talk more about a lot of these issues as we go forward. Indicators of concepts. What we're doing with the quantitative research is we're going to from this abstract level of theories and concepts. We got to get from there all the way down to specific numbers that we can assign to each person that we're comparing. So let's say, for example, that in the past 12 months that Johnny has never gotten into any fights with anybody, has not been violent at all, so he gets a 0. And let's say that his brother Richard got into fights 5 times. So Johnny gets a 0 for that on this measure of violence, and Richard gets a 5. So we went from this very kind of abstract, idea of violence. What does that mean? And we moved from there all the way down to a number for each person in our sample. Let's just keep it real simple. Have 2 kids in our sample, 2 brothers we're comparing. That process of going from concepts down to numbers, that's called operationalization. Fancy term, PowerPoints don't list it here. You should know that term. It means the process of moving from your concepts to your numbers, a specific number for each person. It could also, another term that gets used is quantification. We're turning concepts into numbers through measurement. This operational definition, that is the definition for violence. Let's stick with that as an example. That the definition is concrete enough. It's basically giving us a rule for how to measure this with different people in our sample. So, for example, I might use the operational definition that the degree of violence is the number of times in the past 12 months that the person has gotten into a fight, or a physical fight, or attacked somebody physically, however you want to word it, in the past 12 months, the number of times. See, so now you've gone from this concept of violence to a definition that basically is like a rule, or it's a guide to tell you how to measure this and give a person a number. How many times did they attack somebody in the past year? And so that would be an example of an operational definition. Give me a definition that's concrete enough that I know how to measure it for each person. Okay, so we're moving from concept all the way down to number, and this process is operationalization, and this is the operational definition. It's less directly quantifiable than measures. It's a rule. It's a rule, right? It's a written statement. So it's still not the actual 5 violent incidents for Richard and 0 for Johnny. It's still not numbers yet. It's a verbal definition. How many times have you done this in the past 12 months? Okay. And of course, common sense understandings of the form of a concept might make. So of course, we want to use concepts, and we want to measure them in ways that sort of make sense, that are understandable to people. And it makes sense to try to use words make it easy for people to understand what you're talking about. Most people have a pretty good sense of what violence means. So it makes sense to use the concept of violence and not call it some strange term you never heard of before, when we can use something that's a little more common sense. And then also we want to, follow common sense, or at least respect that when we're coming up with our definitions and how we're going to measure stuff. So anyway, enough on that. More important is this multiple indicator of measures that often you probably would think, well, if we're going to measure violence, all you need to do is ask one question. That one question is a pretty good one of, ask them on a questionnaire, how many times in the past 12 months have you physically attacked somebody, right? And they'll tell you 0 up to whatever number of times. And that's the end of it. One question is really all you need. But what you find among researchers is especially the more sophisticated researchers, is they often think that a single indicator or that's just another way of saying a single question, may not really measure the whole idea of violence quite completely. And then it might be good to ask, 5 or 6 questions about violence so that you get a fuller picture and end up with a more refined and ultimately more accurate picture of violence. So you could ask not only how many times have you physically attacked somebody in the past 12 months, but you could take a little bit different angle and you could ask something like, how many times in the past 12 months have you gotten into a physical group fight? Because sometimes, especially young people, sometimes get in a group or gang fight, multiple people. It's a little bit different way of asking the question. Then you might ask something like, how many times in the past month have you attacked somebody strongly enough that you injured them? So it's not just getting into a fight, but actually doing injury to them, or maybe serious injury, like how many times did you physically attack somebody where they had to go to the hospital and get medical treatment? Or you can slice it lots of different ways. You could say, how many times did you attack somebody, but in the end nobody really got hurt? See, so a minor event, right? So there's lots of different ways you could approach this, but the idea is that if you ask multiple questions, that you're going to get a more accurate, fuller picture of the person's tendency to get involved in violence. And so you'll use what is called a multiple indicator, use several questions to measure it. And sometimes it's helpful to do it because whatever concept it is you're studying, might have multiple dimensions. So it may be kind of a big, broad concept that, well, for example, what you think with, okay, violence really kind of has, it's not only just a physical thing where you attack somebody or hurt them physically. We mentioned earlier about how it could be threats. Some of it could be verbal. If you threaten somebody that you're going to hurt them, that you're going to kill them, that you're going to, I don't know, whatever, do some sort of harm to them or maybe people they care about, that we could think of that as being verbal violence as opposed to physical violence where you're actually physically attacking somebody. You could also have a different dimension where you just attack somebody like a fight where you're just using your fists or using your own body, but you could also ask questions about, have they ever attacked anybody with a weapon? So a violence involving weapons. So see, there's different dimensions here: weapon violence, no weapon violence, and just verbal violence. That's different dimensions. So maybe you need to ask questions about each of those different dimensions of violence so that you can get the full picture. So that's what they mean by different dimensions. And you'll see that this is really true of psychologists, not so much people in our professions, more so in psychology. If you've ever done one of these psychology questionnaires, they ask endless questions. They'll ask 30, 40, 50 questions. A lot of them sound sort of somewhat repetitive or close to each other. It's because they take this multiple indicator approach very seriously, and they think that the best way to really measure with a high degree of accuracy is to ask a zillion questions. I mean, I think sometimes they go overboard, but I understand why they're trying to do it. It is a sophisticated approach. So, well, this video segment has gotten long enough. Let's stop here and we'll see you at part 2.